Okay, yeah, so this is a theme for today that's running through, obviously, the importance of adaptivity in learning and specifically in teacher professional development. But before we start anything, I think I'd just like to take a moment to reflect on the work and the life of this fantastic man, and he'll be sorely missed, Sir Tim Brighouse. I did actually write quite a lot about this and then rehearsed it last night and had a bit of trouble, so we're just going to carry on through. So last year when I opened the event, I sort of talked about how we were at an inflection point in the education system where we can either choose to apply what we now know about teacher professional development and what we now know about pedagogy and use the tools that we have at our disposal in order to do that, or not, but we probably should. I also feel now, reflecting on things, that we also face a different inflection point where the path ahead can either look like rigid accountability frameworks to take people forward or adaptive networks of people and experience. And I sincerely believe that we should be opting for the latter. So when we talk about adaptivity or adaptation in education, obviously it comes in a variety of flavours. You know, the standards that we're working to, are they in dialogue with the needs of our learners, with the needs of the profession? Are the programmes of learning serving up what we need, and is that adaptive to local context and local need? Is the individual pathway, the journey that I'm on, able to adapt to my specific needs and the needs of my learners? And then finally, the pedagogy that I'm learning through these programs, am I free to adapt and refine that to the specific needs of my learners? And am I equipped with the sufficient knowledge to know whether that's a helpful adaptation or a lethal mutation? These are sort of really crucial themes when we start talking about adaptation. One thing we do know about adaptivity in education, in professional development, and actually just in learning more generally, is that adaptability is allergic to scale. It's a sort of perennial problem that we have. We're faced with either having a high cost program with high levels of adaptability, lots of personalization, lots of feedback, lots of personalized feedback that leads to great outcomes, or we can have a program at scale that, because of the cost of scaling the adaptivity alongside it, tends to lead to worse outcomes. And my question is, today, for the conference and for us as people who develop technology, is can we find mechanisms and tools to address this issue so that we can take really great PD to scale for every teacher? So I'd just like to take a minute to introduce three teachers who we will refer to initially in terms of some of the challenges they're having, but then also reflect on what we can learn from that moving forward. So this is Johnny. So his head of department regularly visits his classroom, identifies areas for improvement, and engages him in sort of intensive, deliberate practice in his areas of deficiency. John doesn't really see much difference between this and performance management. Both processes involve senior leaders sitting in his room and diagnosing his teaching. Johnny doesn't really see how focusing on one technique after another helps him to become a more rounded professional. This is Layla. Every month, someone observes her lesson and then asks her some open questions about her practice. She finds classroom management really challenging, but the monthly game of guess what's in the coach's head isn't really helping her in any constructive way. She feels frustrated and inadequate. And here's Chris. He's a more experienced teacher for whom professional development opportunities are limited. It seems all of the resources in the school are going on their intensive instructional coaching program with more junior members of staff. So how did we get here? Certainties. Chris's school has pursued instructional coaching to the exclusion of other methods with greater reach within the school because they believe that only instructional coaching has any kind of research validation. Equally, Johnny's school has adopted a coach-led, rehearsal-heavy model because they believe that that's what instructional coaching means. And finally, Layla's school firmly believe that a coach should never tell a teacher what to do. All three positions represent, I would argue, a misinterpretation of the evidence base. So let's consider Johnny first. What are the notion that instructional coaching should always be directed and involve a high level of deliberate practice? Let's explore where Johnny's autonomy issue comes from. The idea that coaches should take the lead in identifying needs and managing development and progress. So I've got very dry mouth. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Cheers, bud. Right, language really matters. For example, this is, I think, probably the most influential report that's been published recently around professional development. And if you look on the right-hand side here are the categories and the language that was used in that report. Building knowledge, motivating teachers, prompting, monitoring, all this sort of stuff. And actually, for each one of these categories that was used, there's a more natural language that we've been using in education for decades to describe those interactions. And I think actually, I don't know if there's any linguists in the house, but the one thing you can say is this language is devoid of teacher autonomy. And the funny thing is that this language didn't emerge from the research, from the papers. They were predefined, and then much more sort of teacher-centric programs were sort of shoehorned into them. So I think that really matters. And another area where language really matters in this regard is with regards to the term instructional coaching. So obviously instructional coaching is inherently a US thing, that's where it came from, but in the US it just means coaching about instruction, coaching about what you do in classrooms every day. It doesn't mean that the coaching itself should have to be instructional. So the other area was around that level of deliberate practice that's inherent within instructional coaching. So this comes down to Kraft-Blazar's work. Again, I think one of the main things that's been responsible for sort of popularising the approach within the UK. And what they did is obviously had to sort of define what, for their meta-analysis, was instructional coaching and what was not. And they included these categories as their definitions, one of which was focused. Coaches work with teachers to engage in deliberate practice of specific skills. The trouble is, there are two kind of definitions of deliberate practice. One, in that sort of Erickson model, which is this idea that's sort of decontextualized, coach-led, and very specific. And then there's this like just practicing it deliberately idea, which is more of a sort of colloquialism. It's very abundant when you dig into the papers within Kraft and Blazar. They were using that second definition. In fact, the most highly performing paper in that study was the MTP, or my teaching partner, involved no element of what we would call like a decontextualized deliberate practice whatsoever. Sorry, bear with me 1 second. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just interesting that when you look at the kind of definition of rehearsal that came through within the EEF study, it very, very much focuses on the fact that it was decontextualized role play in service of habit formation. That's the key theme that comes through within that. However, when you look in the EEF study, a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the papers actually involved a coach leading any kind of process of rehearsal. Far, far more common was some form of workshop rehearsal, or in fact, the most common of all of those that were categorized as involving rehearsal, it was some form of cognitive rehearsal, sitting there co-planning or discussing how you're going to be implementing this technology, technique in the classroom. So it's interesting for me that these languages and these themes have emerged through these two papers, but actually, ultimately, when we look at it, I'm aware of one randomized controlled trial study that looked at a rehearsal-heavy, coach-led program of instructional coaching that led to any kind of improvement, and I'm not aware of one in the mainstream setting that led to an improvement greater than other forms of professional development. But I think the really important thing here with what I'm saying is absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. There is emerging research in the space of novice teachers that shows a sort of decontextualized role play and being coach-led makes a difference there. And also, it fits with that broader interpretation we have about how our cognitive processing works. So, for example, it makes sense that when you are engaging with a skill for the first time, that the actual process of acquiring that skill is going to use up a lot of resources in our working memory. And in that context, it makes sense for a coach to take the responsibility, take that burden off us for noticing what needs to be worked on and for scripting out and managing a process of improvement. You can see here now, when we think of poor Layla, who's struggling with classroom management, how by not stepping in and just by asking open questions, her coach was basically condemning her to stay where she is. Equally, as expertise starts to emerge, it's very clear that if the coach continues to notice and adapt for you, then you're never going to get the experience of being able to do that, leading to you getting stuck where you are effectively in a hamster wheel of professional development, like Johnny. And these are not consequence-free failures of professional development. Being good at it and feeling like you can address the challenges you face every day is the number one reported reason why people stay in the education profession, in the education system. So really, not meeting people's needs, not adapting our professional learning and our coaching to where they are is very, very dangerous. So when we talk about how learning can adapt within coaching programs or PD in general, generally think of it in these three sort of domains. The scope, how much am I taking on with you? Am I focusing on a very small element, a particular skill, or are we looking more holistically about the integration of those skills together alongside mental models and our declarative knowledge? Where on this autonomy spectrum are we? Are we being very directed and taking responsibility, or are we being teacher-led and facilitative? And then there's this sort of authenticity of practice question. Is it synthetic? Are we decontextualized so that we can just focus on the skills? Or are we looking to integrate it into practice in classrooms? So these are the three domains, and this is my terrifying conception of how those things can fit together within a process of skill acquisition and professional growth. So you've got whether the practice is synthetic or authentic, so out of the classroom, in the classroom, whether the coach is being directed and taking responsibility for identifying issues, or being facilitative and supporting the teacher to solve their own problems. And this is my notion of the scope. So down here we're looking at small aspects, granular aspects of my teaching skill. Up here we're working out how it all fits together in order to meet the needs of learners. And of course you've got high intensity and then a slightly easier intensity moving forward and less frequency. So there you go. But the problem with all of this is, how do you build a coaching or professional development program to meet the needs around that kind of model? It's really hard, because think of this coaching skill necessary to be able to identify where a teacher is and what their next step should be. It's really hard. It isn't untrodden ground. If you look at the cognitive apprenticeship model, you'll see that built into this model is this idea of increasing autonomy over time as people work through the cycle, plus the idea of coach fading. So the input from the coach is fading over time through this model. But yes, it's really, really hard to do. So how have we taken the first step at trying to solve this problem? What we have on the platform is a series of pathways. So, Iris Connect's obviously video-based. You can record your practice, analyze it, get feedback, all that sort of stuff. But we realized that people needed frameworks to help them work through this process. Record your practice. Here's a rubric to help you see below the surface layer and understand the learning. Here's a place where we can start thinking about, what am I going to do differently? How am I going to implement it in classrooms? Those sort of frameworks. And we realized that those frameworks could be mapped into this skill emergence graph. So we've got pathways of learning that are aligned with skill development down at this end, where the coach takes a lead and we're focusing with lots of deliberate practice on very highly specific aspects of teaching. And then all the way through to some facilitative coaching models where the guidance for the coach is supporting them to facilitate the learning in a broader sense of the teacher. One of the key things about this is that these pathways are providing guidance and structures for the teacher, but also for the coach as they're going through this process, providing some level of support and hopefully reducing that demand, that challenge that we'd have of genuinely being adaptive in our coaching strategies. And what about poor, can anyone remind me of his name? Chris. Yes, dear Chris. What about his predicament? Well, of course, the other thing that was very evident within the EEF report was that the modality of professional development, like whether I'm calling this coaching or whether I'm calling this a reflection cycle or whether this is lesson study, matters far less than the mechanisms that exist within the program. So we don't have to do instructional coaching. We can engage in other forms of professional learning, some of which have got a one-to-many dynamic, meaning that you're not just tying one coach into one coachee. We've got the ability to reach more staff with the same level of resources. In fact, one of the interesting things about this is that the highest performing modality was one that had aspects of all of this. And so that's what we've sought to do on IRIS, is also introduce pathways that support that teacher collaborative dynamic and a self-reflection pathway where teachers engage with this sort of work independently. And we're delighted that these pathways have been recognised by the Chartered College of Teaching and support teachers towards the Development of Teaching Practice Award and the mentoring one as well. So that's really awesome, and they are by far the highest one used on our platform at the moment, because you can just start. How do you know which combination? Obviously, you've got a pathway, how we're learning, but you've got to know also what we're learning, what we're focusing on, and how do you know what's right for you? This is another big coaching challenge. Somewhere else that we've been putting our energy recently, and I'm sure we can give you a demonstration of it later if you want to come over to the laptop out in the corridor, using large language models to analyze lessons against rubrics and make those kind of suggestions / recommendations to teachers about where they could gainfully focus their time and energy. In fact, that same system can allow them to track their progress over time as they work through these pathways. So this is what we're talking about when it comes to sort of adaptivity at scale, using tools of this nature in order to make that possible. And if you don't like our pathways, we'll build one for you. And that's something that we've been working on as well, adapting to individual school need and capturing the talent and knowledge that's already in the system and turning them into these step-by-step processes that engage people with all those key mechanisms to lead to effective learning outcomes. Final word, I mentioned that content. Last year we led on this a little bit more, but we've gone through the process of our own kind of meta-analysis of high leverage strategies to support teacher practice, and in here you'll find video examples and interviews with domain experts, etc., that will really introduce the theory that sit behind these high leverage strategies. But they didn't get granular enough, didn't focus in enough on what am I actually going to physically do next. So today I'm delighted to announce that we are integrating Iris Connect with teaching walkthroughs that will allow teachers to go on one of these pathways, identify a challenge, and then pull in a walkthrough that will help them through this step-by-step process, either of engaging in deliberate practice or refining their practice in context. Hopefully, that will also build into a community bank of expertise that we can nurture and develop over time. But that's for the future. For now, thank you.